Start. Hello everyone, and a very good morning to all of you. Welcome to this e-lecture series which is being organized by Aries. So this is the 19th lecture in the series, and in this talk I'll be presenting a brief overview of the energetic explosions in the universe. So this talk is pitched at an undergraduate level, and I will not be going into the technical details of the physics behind these cosmic explosions. However, I will try to give you a flavor of what these explosions in the universe are. So let us begin with this question: how old is our universe? So the universe is 13.8 billion years old. The Milky Way is around 13.6 billion years old. Our sun is about 4.5 billion years old, and Earth is roughly of the same age as 4.5 billion years of age. And we believe that most of the galaxies were formed around 13 billion years, around the time the Milky Way was formed. And this is where the galaxy formation started. If you look at the HR diagram here, where the y-axis is the luminosity in solar units and the x-axis is the surface temperature, where towards the right hand side the temperature decreases and towards the left hand side the temperature increases. And these are the different spectral sequences, the O, B, A, F, G, K, M. These represents the different kinds of stars having different temperatures. So our sun is right over here on the main sequence, which is around 5500 degree Kelvin. And this is the main sequence where most of the hydrogen burning in the stars go on. And some of the famous stars in our own galaxy Milky Way have been listed over here. On the lower left, you see a white dwarf sequence, and on the right over here, there are the giant stars and the supergiants. So these supergiants are of great importance, which are resulting in the explosions. These supergiants have very high luminosities, as you can see over here, and they have moderate temperatures. So we will be looking into the supergiant phase of these stars and how these supergiants end their lives. Okay. So just imagine if you could see something in the universe which has emitted as much energy as nearly the entire universe for just a few seconds. And all of the world's greatest observatories would be just dying to look for this object. Mind it, during this explosion, it will release huge amount of energy of the order of 10 to the power of 51 ergs. So what could this be? And this explosion is just occurring in a few seconds, and in whichever galaxy this explosion occurs, it will outshine the entire galaxy for just a few seconds. Over here I have shown the electromagnetic spectrum, the different wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum, and how these explosions could be monitored in the different wavelengths across the electromagnetic spectrum. So what are these explosions? What would you be seeing at? You would be seeing at the stellar explosions, where the star explodes. And these explosions are known as the supernova explosion and the gamma ray burst. These are the two biggest explosions after the Big Bang, and which is why they are of extreme importance. Not only studying stellar deaths is important, from where these objects are actually resulting, but they are also important probes to study the cosmological universe. Supernovae, as you all might be knowing, are used as standard candles to estimate the distances to the galaxies, and gamma ray bursts, because they are occurring in external galaxies, are very useful probes to study the cosmological context. Now, how many supernovae do we expect typically? So nearly 10 supernovae explode every second in the universe. So there is no dearth of dying stars basically. Every second there would be a dying star in the universe. And nearly one or two supernovae per century in the galaxy like our own Milky Way. So the chances of a star exploding in a Milky Way is very, very rare, although not completely negligible, but it is very, very rare. It's about one or two supernovae per century in a year. Whereas in external galaxies, in the whole universe, you would see about 10 supernovae exploding every second. Similarly, in the case of GRBs, gamma ray bursts are abbreviated as GRB, and one GRB is detected every day. And what would be the rate in Milky Way? In Milky Way, typically one would expect to see 10 to the power of 1 GRB every 10 to the power of 4 to 10 to the power of 6 years, which is like extremely, extremely rare. And this is the rate for a long GRB. I have written long over here, the details of which I will come to in just a few slides later. So as you can see from the name here, what does supernova mean? So nova is a Latin word which means new, and super is simply awesome. These are freaking awesome objects in the universe. These are also known as guest stars because they just appear for a little bit of time in the sky and then would vanish away. On the other hand, gamma rays are sudden intense flashes of gamma rays, and which is why they are known as gamma ray burst. Burst because it is coming from the bursting of a star. Now, the rates that I have mentioned here are for the entire universe, and in the Milky Way, the chances are very, very rare. However, if these explosions occur in our own galaxy, Milky Way, it's going to be disastrous. It would blow off the ozone layer of the Earth, creating a mass extinction, which is not going to be very good for us. Okay. Now, I said that these are very energetic explosions. So just to give you an idea of the energies involved in these explosions, on the left over here, I have put down the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, which resulted in energy of about 6 into 10 to the power of 20 ergs. Whereas in a supernova explosion, you would see the energy of the order of 10 to the power of 51 erg. And gamma ray bursts are 100 times more energetic as compared to supernovae, releasing nearly 10 to the power of 53 ergs of energy. So you see, these cosmic explosions are nowhere comparable to the atomic bombings that we see in the Earth. Now, I just want to give a comparison with with the nearest star, the Sun. So Sun releases about 3 times 10 to the power of 33 erg per second of energy. When it has to reach 10 to the power of 51 erg of energy that released by a supernova explosion, it would require 5 billion years. That is a long, long time to go. This is like 5 into 10 to the power of 9 years for the Sun to release 10 to the power of 51 ergs of energy, which is why these events are so exotic and extremely, extremely energetic. Okay, moving on, I will give you an overview of what supernovae are. So our study of supernovae was revolutionized in the year 1987 when a very bright naked eye supernova SN 1987A was detected in the Tarantula Nebula in the Large Magellanic Cloud. So Large Magellanic Cloud is a satellite galaxy of the Milky Way, which is at a very close by distance of about 50 parsecs from here. An idea to give you what the distance scales are. So 1 parsec corresponds to 3 times 10 to the power of 18 centimeters. So the distance of LMC is about 50 kiloparsec. And when the progenitor or the star which gave rise to SN 1987A was studied, it was found that the star was Sandulic minus 69202. The star was a blue supergiant of nearly 20 solar masses. So this naked eye supernova, which we could see with our naked eyes, was due to the death of a blue supergiant star whose initial mass was around 20 solar masses. And the resulting explosion from supernova 1987A gave new clues to the understanding of the nature, and this was a very, very big thing in astronomy, because this is the nearest supernova studied till date, and it appeared in the Time magazine and in various other media platforms, because this was a huge discovery. An important thing to note here is that 1987A is still visible even after more than 30 years of its explosion. But now what you can see from the explosion is the ring of dust around the remnant of this supernova. So the image on the right over here is an HST optical image which is taken in the IR bands, and you can clearly see the ring structure, which is because of the dust. And the left image over here is an X-ray image taken with the Chandra X-ray Observatory, and in this also the ring is clearly visible. Okay. So there have been historical records of supernovae as well, and the discovery of supernovae dates back to the 1054 AD. So SN 1054 was reported by the Chinese astronomers, and this yellow mark over here shows the passage of the supernova 1054, and at that time the Chinese astronomers called it as the guest supernova. So the famous Crab Nebula is a pulsar wind nebula which is associated with this supernova 1054. So although the explosion took place in 1054 AD, but this Crab Nebula is a result of that explosion and is a remnant. It is a famous pulsar wind nebula. Okay. So what happened during the Big Bang? So most of the hydrogen, helium and lithium were produced during the Big Bang. So these are all the light elements that were produced during the Big Bang. But our universe consists of many heavy elements. Even the elements that we see in our day-to-day life, like the calcium in our bones, the aluminum with which the cars are made of, and several other heavy elements, how were they formed? Because in the Big Bang only these light elements were formed. So where did these heavy elements come from? So the main source of the heavy elements is from the explosions of these stars. When these stars explode, they form these heavy elements. So this is the onion shell structure of a massive star, in which the central core is iron, and then there are progressive layers of different elements starting from silicon up to hydrogen, which is the outermost layer. So this has all the heavy elements. So when an explosion of such kind of a star takes place, heavy elements are released in the universe, which are then reaching the earth through asteroids or any other means, and these are the main sources of the heavy elements we see in our day-to-day lives. Okay. So this is a typical supernova explosion. When a supernova explosion takes place, the material is being blown out. As you can see from this picture over here, the material is being blown out in different directions, and this material consists of all the elements that we were talking in the previous slide. Okay. So supernovae are the fundamentals of creation. This is the periodic table which you would have studied in chemistry classes, but most of these elements are coming from the universe. So where are these elements coming from? So there is a color coding done which over here. One is the blue ones represent the elements from the Big Bang fusion, and as we said, in the Big Bang only the lighter elements were formed, like hydrogen, helium and little bit of lithium. Then there is cosmic ray fission, there is merging neutron stars giving rise to these very heavy elements over here, like the lanthanides, the dying low mass stars like strontium over here, the exploding massive stars on which we will be focusing about today, the exploding massive stars giving rise to aluminum, silicon, phosphorus, sulfur and various other metals over here, then the exploding white dwarf. So most of our understanding of the elements present are coming from the cosmic origins. Okay. Let's move on into a little bit of detail for the traditional supernovae. And what is the classification scheme followed by the supernovae? So supernovae are basically divided into broadly two subclasses, the type 1 and the type 2. So type 2 do not show any hydrogen, and the type 2s have abundance of hydrogen in their spectrum. So this is a typical spectrum where you have flux on the y-axis and you have wavelength on the x-axis. So when you plot flux against the wavelength, you will get a typical spectrum. As you can see, for a supernova of type 2, there is abundance of hydrogen. You can see the H alpha and the H beta lines. If you look at the type 1 supernova over here, there is no presence of any hydrogen line over here, whereas silicon and sulfur and some of the iron lines are present in abundance in the type 1 supernovae. So type 1 and type 2 are again subdivided into various other classes. We may not go into the details of all of these classes. This classification is based on the presence or absence of some of the lines that are seen in the spectrum. Whereas in the case of type 2, the classification is based on the shape of the light curve. So what do we mean by a light curve? When you plot the magnitude or the flux against time on the x-axis, you will get a light curve, which means how the light of the supernova is evolving. So the red one over here shows the light curve of a type 1a supernova, and the ones with the dashed line show the light curve of the type 2 supernova. So type 2 supernova they have sort of flat light curves, whereas the type 1 have sharply peaked light curves. Okay. Now, in the previous slide, we saw that the classification was only based on the presence or the absence of some of the elemental abundances in the spectrum or the shape of the light curve. However, there should be some physical mechanism also governing these explosions. Now, the commonly accepted mechanism for type 1a supernova are the result of thermonuclear supernova, which means you have a binary system where one is a white dwarf, the other is a low mass star in a binary system, and this low mass accumulates. The white dwarf will accumulate the mass, it will accrete the mass from the low mass star, and when this reaches the Chandrasekhar mass limit of 1.4 solar masses, it will give rise to a catastrophic explosion, giving rise to type 1a supernovae. On the other hand, the remaining of these subclasses are a result of core collapse of massive stars. So you have a massive star in which the central core is the iron core with layers of different elements outside the silicon or outside the iron core, and hydrogen being the outermost. And when that core collapses, it gives rise to these kinds of supernovae. So there are predominantly two explosion mechanisms: the thermonuclear coming from a white dwarf system, and the core collapse coming from the collapse of massive stars. Okay, so this is a picture of a stellar life cycle which elaborates the life cycle of a star right from birth going up to main sequence, the old age, the death of stars, and once they die, what remnant they will leave behind. So as we all know that the stars are formed from molecular clouds of hydrogen. These molecular clouds give rise to protostars. Protostars are the newly born stars, and then you have the open clusters. From here, it can either, if the mass is too low, it will become a white dwarf where the mass is less than 0.08 solar masses. The fate of low mass star less than 8 solar mass, and massive star which is greater than 8 times the mass of the sun will have different fates. The life cycle of a massive star as well as a low mass star is going to be different. So the low mass star, which have masses less than 8 times less than the solar mass, will evolve into a red giant. It could form a planetary nebula, a white dwarf, or a black dwarf, and then, or this could be in a binary system with a low mass star as a binary companion of a white dwarf. This would accrete, the white dwarf would accrete matter. When it reaches the Chandrasekhar mass limit of 1.4 solar masses, it blasts off in a catastrophic explosion as a type 1a supernova. So this is the common formation mechanism of a type 1a supernova. And because the type 1a supernova are catastrophic explosions, there is a complete deflagration of this system which is giving rise to a type 1a supernova. There will be no remnant left over here. So there is nothing in the remnant. The binary system just dies, giving rise to a type 1a supernova. Whereas in the case of a massive star, it evolves into a red supergiant. When the red supergiant, the core collapses, it gives rise to a type 2 supernova. The outer layers are expelled out and the core collapses, and the result could be a neutron star or a black hole. These are the remnants which could be formed when a type 1a supernova, when type 2 supernova is born. But a black hole will be formed only when the mass of this red supergiant, the star giving rise to the supernova, is greater than 40 solar masses. And in the case of a neutron star, the mass of this supergiant has to be less than 40 solar masses. The emission from the black hole could be seen in the this would give rise to different kinds of emission like a pulsar, which can be studied in the radio or the X-ray wavelengths. We were talking about these thermonuclear supernovae which are coming from a binary system, and in this binary system it could be a white dwarf or a low mass star, where the white dwarf is accreting the matter from this star, and when it reaches the Chandrasekhar mass limit or it exceeds the Chandrasekhar mass limit, it will result in a catastrophic explosion giving rise to a thermonuclear or a type 1a supernova. Now it's not necessary that you should have a low mass as a binary companion to this white dwarf. You can also have a white dwarf or a white dwarf neutron star system could also give rise to a catastrophic explosion resulting in a thermonuclear supernova. Okay. Okay. Now let us see what a core collapse supernova is. So this is an onion shell structure of an evolved star, where the central core is the central iron core, because iron is the most stable element and has the highest binding energy per nucleon. It cannot undergo any further nuclear fusion reactions, whereas the outer layers are progressively of other elements, with hydrogen being the outermost layer. And the typical radius of such a star is around 6 times 10 to the power of 8 kilometers. Now, there is extreme gravitational pressure from outside, whereas when this core has accumulated mass greater than the Chandrasekhar mass limit of 1.4 solar masses, the degeneracy pressure inside this core is no longer able to sustain the gravitational pressure from the outside, which is shown over here with the inward arrows. Then this core collapses. The outer layers of the star are blown off. And when this core collapses, the iron core has a typical radius of 6 times 10 to the power of 3 kilometers. When this collapses, this gives rise to a supernova explosion with a radius of around 2 times 10 to the power of 3 kilometers. So this is again another catastrophic collapse. But when this collapse happens, the core collapses and it leaves behind a remnant. As I had shown in the life cycle of a star, the remnant could either be a neutron star or a black hole. Usually it is a neutron star in the case of type 2 supernovae or the core collapse supernovae. So how much time will this actually take? You have a star which then collapses and becomes a supernova. So these stars are typically a few million years of age. So it will take about a few million years for a star to die, less than a quarter of a second for a star for the core to collapse. So this core collapse takes place in just a fraction of a second, and then a few hours for the shock wave to reach the surface of the star, a few months to brighten up, and just a few years to fade away again. So a few months to brighten up, it means the light that we will be seeing from the supernova after the explosion has taken place. Okay. To summarize, what are type 1 and type 2 supernovae? I have listed some of the important features over here. So beginning with the light curve, the type 1 light curves are shorter peaked light curves. This is a typical light curve of a type 1 supernova, and the light that we are seeing from the supernova is governed by the radioactive decay of these elements, 56 nickel and 56 cobalt. On the other hand, the type 2 light curves are long, flat light curves. So for a comparison here, the green light curve is that of a type 1 supernova, and the magenta one over here is that of a type 2 supernova. So this has a flat and a long light curve. In terms of the spectral properties, in type 1a supernova there is no hydrogen, but there is lots of silicon and iron present in the explosion. The type 2 explosions have abundance of hydrogen, seen by these H alpha, H beta lines. Now, where do these type 1a supernovae occur? They are located near both young and old stars. So this is a picture of an elliptical galaxy. These are older galaxies. So type 1 supernova are found in these older galaxies, whereas type 2 supernovae are located near massive, young massive stars. So this is a typical example of a spiral galaxy which is rich in star formation. There's a lot of star formation going on in this, and this has young massive stars which could give rise to the type 2 supernovae. So these are the diversities or the characteristic differences seen between the type 1a and the type 2 supernovae. Okay. The second biggest explosion after Big Bang that we spoke about a little bit in the beginning of this lecture was the gamma ray bursts. As the name indicates, these are explosions with radiation in the gamma ray bands. Now let us look what these GRBs are. So there's a very interesting story to the history of GRBs. These GRBs were detected in the late 1960s by the US military And at that time, it was not known what these cosmic sources are. So Vela had detected something like this. On the y-axis, you have the counts per second, and on the x-axis, you have the time. So Vela satellite recorded a pulse for a very small fraction of time. So these were serendipitous discoveries by these military satellites. Now, these are very short, intense pulses of gamma rays. This can extend up to MeV energy ranges also, but they last for a very few seconds. In extreme cases, they can last for hundreds or thousands of seconds, but typically these pulses are very short-lived. These pulses are non-repetitive, which means they're coming from random directions in the sky. So this was an old satellite which was called BATSE, and it detected nearly 3000 GRBs, and in this plane, these 300 GRBs were distributed all across, which means these GRBs do not have any preferential location. They are randomly distributed and they can come from any direction in the sky. And typically, one would expect to see one burst per day on an average. Now, when I say they are isotropically distributed, this also indicates that these are cosmological sources. Cosmological meaning they are coming from external galaxies. Because these bursts are so bright and are located at extremely high distances, they have a huge energy output of the order of 10 to the power of 48 to 54 ergs. So in the supernova explosion, we saw that the energy is around 10 to the power of 51 ergs, whereas in a typical GRB, you would see the total energy output of the order of 10 to the power of 53 ergs. This is our present day understanding of the cosmological distances for the GRBs. The nearest GRB is located at a redshift of 0.008, and the highest redshift GRB is located at a redshift of 9.4. We will come to this point again because this is a fundamental reason why GRBs are used as cosmic probes. Now, how do these GRBs occur? So these GRBs are also coming from the collapse of massive stars. But these stars are not the same as the stars which are giving rise to a supernova. They're massive. For both supernova and gamma ray burst, the progenitor star has to be a massive star. In addition, to give rise to a GRB, the star also has to be a rapidly rotating star to conserve the angular momentum. And in such a star, what will happen? When such a star undergoes collapse supernova, it will leave a remnant as a central black hole. This will form an accretion disk around it, and because of the accretion disk, these jets are launched, which give rise to a GRB. Now, when this material is going out after the explosion, low energy gamma rays are generated, and these faster moving shells will catch up with the slower moving shells, giving rise to the internal shocks. And it is these internal shocks which is giving rise to the burst photons, which means the energy that we are seeing in the gamma ray bands is coming because of this region. These shells are colliding with each other, giving rise to an internal shock which radiates in gamma rays. Okay. Now, there is still material which is moving outwards. Now, this material when it interacts with the ambient medium. Ambient meaning the medium close to the surroundings of the explosion. When this collides with the ambient medium, it gives rise to external shock. And in this external shock, these photons or the electrons give rise to an afterglow emission. As the name implies, afterglow meaning after the burst. Burst is a burst of photons where it is glowing, and once that burst has taken place, it gives rise to an afterglow, and this afterglow is visible in the different wavelength regions of the electromagnetic spectrum, starting from high energy gamma rays to right up to the radio, centimeter and the millimeter wave bands. So there are classically two phases of the burst. One is this burst phase, which is up to here, and once it interacts with the external medium or the ambient medium, you have the afterglow phase. So in this phase, you will see the energy or the radiation only in the gamma rays. In the afterglow, you will see the radiation across the different wavelength regions of the electromagnetic spectrum. Now so once this explosion has taken place, you have lost all the information about the progenitor star or the central engine which is giving rise to such a phenomena. So what can you basically calculate from here? So this is an isotropic explosion, and you can calculate the gamma ray isotropic energy, which is nothing but 4 pi times dl squared, where dl is your luminosity distance, times the fluence. Now fluence is the flux in the gamma ray bands that will be recorded once such a phenomena is recorded by the space satellites. We will come to that in a little bit. So if you have an information about the redshift, you will also know the luminosity distance, and a measurement of the fluence would give you the total isotropic energy in the gamma ray bands. Now we know that this emission is coming out in the form of jets. So there is a certain jet opening angle which is known as theta. This is a collimated jet, and once you have information about this collimation, you can calculate the afterglow energy, which is nothing but the kinetic energy of the afterglow. Okay. So what is governing this prompt emission? Prompt meaning the emission which is coming immediately after the burst has taken place, and this is in the gamma ray bands. So the most common accepted model for the prompt emission is can be described using a band function, which is nothing but a combination of two power laws. One power law over here and the other power law over here. So this is how you explain this. This is a spectrum. You have nu f nu on the y direction and energy in the x direction. And once you have a two power law function like this, which is known as the band function, most of the prompt emission spectra can be explained using this band function. Okay. The next part was the afterglow that are seen in the GRBs. What are these afterglows? These afterglows are longer lasting low frequency components. As we mentioned before, that the burst is a very short-lived phenomena. It will just last for a few seconds or for a few hundreds or tens of seconds and then completely vanish. Whereas these afterglows, they are long-lasting components, and they can be seen across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. The burst, on the other hand, can only be seen in the gamma ray bands. So this is one image of an afterglow of a famous GRB 030329. So here 03 means the year 2003, next 03 means the month, which is March, and 29th means the date. So this GRB occurred on 29th March 2003. And when all of the telescopes were looking at these at the location of this burst, an afterglow in the optical bands was detected for this GRB. This is an image which was taken on 3rd April 2003. The same field was again observed on 1st May 2003, and you can see a considerable fading of the afterglow. It is very bright over here, and in about a month's time it has faded. It is not of the same brightness as the previous observation. So this indicates that the afterglows fade with time. They follow a temporal evolution in time, and over time they will fade. Okay. Now, when we mention that the GRBs are located at cosmological distances in external galaxies having certain redshift, so GRB 980425 was the smoking gun case where the redshift was determined as 0.008. To give you an idea of the distance scales, this redshift corresponds to 37 megaparsec or 0.120 gigalight year, where 1 megaparsec is around 3 times 10 to the power 24 centimeters and 1 gigalight year is 9 times 10 to the power 26 centimeters. So at this redshift, how much time would the light take to reach us on the Earth? It would take about 0.112 gigayears of time to reach us. Now, this is the lowest redshift GRB we have seen till date since the advent of this field, and 090429b GRB is the one which is the tip of the iceberg. This is the highest redshift GRB known. At a redshift of 9.4, you can see the comparisons over here. The scales of the redshift or the distances that the GRBs cover from 008 to 9.4. This corresponds to a distance of around this much in megaparsecs, and the light travel time is around 13.201 giga years, which is more or less similar to the age of our universe. So these are coming, this phenomena is coming from very, very early. The galaxies which were formed very early on in time. So the light travel time for a nearby GRB is only this much, whereas from a very high redshift object is around this much. So this is just to give you an idea of the distance scales involved in these explosions. Okay. Now, we know that the afterglows are long-lasting components across the different wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum. We also every now and then mention about their cosmological origin, giving their redshift ranges. But how are these redshifts measured? These redshifts are measured when you get a spectrum of the afterglow. When you get a spectrum of the afterglow, the lines would be redshifted. The lines that appear in the spectrum would be redshifted. But it is not always very easy to get the spectroscopy of the afterglows, which is why sometimes the galaxies in which these bursts have occurred are also observed to estimate the redshifts. On the other hand, photometric redshifts can also be obtained. If you have observations in different bands of the optical region of the electromagnetic spectrum, then you can also calculate the photometric redshifts. So this is just to give you an idea of how the spectrum of a very high redshift GRB, which is located at a redshift of 8.1, looks like, and how the redshift was calculated for such a GRB. Okay. Now, the afterglows that we see are coming because of the synchrotron radiation. Now, this synchrotron radiation is a non-thermal radiation. It has a non-thermal spectrum and it is made of piecewise power laws. Piecewise meaning this is joined over here, this is joined over here, this is joined over here. This is just a schematic diagram. It is not up to the scale, where your flux in the spectrum varies as nu to the power of minus beta, where beta is your spectral index. And these are the different frequencies in the electromagnetic spectrum: the radio, optical, and the X-rays. And the light curves are also varying with time, where the flux is proportional to t to the power of minus alpha, where alpha is your temporal decay index. In the light curve, your y-axis is flux and x-axis is time. So the decay in the flux is governed by this decay rate alpha in the case of the afterglow light curves. And these afterglow light curves can also be observed in the different frequencies, right from optical, X-rays to radio bands. Okay. Now there are predominantly two classes of GRBs, the short GRBs and the long GRBs. As you can see from the figure over here, it follows a bimodal distribution. The x-axis is time and the y-axis is the number of GRBs. So if this time, I have written T90 over here. So T90 means when a burst is detected, the accumulation of 90% of the counts in the detector, meaning how much time it took to collect the 90% of the counts. That would give you an indication of the T90. So T90 has a cut around 2 seconds. If your T90 is greater than 2 seconds, this class is known as the long GRBs, and if your T90 is less than 2 seconds, this class of GRBs is known as the short GRBs. It is not only because of the T90 duration, but also the spectrum of both of these classes differ. The short GRBs have a hard spectrum and the long GRBs have a soft spectrum. Now when you are clearly seeing two classes, this also indicates behind two different models for the origin of these two classes of GRBs. When there are two different models which are giving rise to these two classes of GRBs, it means that the progenitors of these two GRBs are different. And we will just discuss about this in a little bit of a time. And the host galaxy observations also support this. So what are host galaxies? So host galaxies are the galaxies in which these explosions are taking place. Those are known as the host galaxies. So two classes of GRBs, meaning two kinds of progenitor models, as well as the different kinds of host galaxies in which these explosions are taking place. Okay, so what are these? How are long and short bursts formed? So long bursts, which have a duration of 2 seconds, are coming from the collapse of a very massive star. The mass is around like more than 40 solar masses or so in typical long duration GRBs. Again, like a supernova, the core collapses, the outer layers are spelled out. There is a central black hole remnant which is formed, around which is an accretion disk, and jets are launched. So this is a typical scenario giving rise to a long duration burst. And how are short gamma ray bursts coming? The short bursts are lasting for less than 2 seconds, and these are thought to be coming from binary compact object mergers, meaning two binary objects, a white dwarf or a white dwarf black hole, not a white dwarf, a neutron star or a neutron star black hole system. They're in a binary system, they are spiraling around, they eventually collide, and when they collide, they give rise to a central remnant as a black hole. Again, an accretion disk is formed and jets are launched. So, the jet launching mechanism is the same in both long and short GRBs. However, the progenitors are very, very different. The long ones are coming from the collapse of massive stars. The short ones are coming from the merger of two compact objects in a binary system. Now, these are not only theories which are saying which progenitor gives rise to which class of GRBs, but it has been observationally seen also. So, in the case of the long gamma ray bursts, the host galaxy observations as well the association with a supernova, with a core collapse supernova, confirms the progenitors of long GRBs as collapse of massive stars, and the recent discovery of the gravitational wave event 1708-17A, which was a result of the merger of two neutron stars, and the association of that gravitational wave event with a short GRB confirms that merger of two compact objects are giving rise to short gamma ray bursts. However, so far we have only one observational evidence from a single gravitational wave event, but in the advanced LIGO era, we are expecting to see more of these associations to confirm the progenitor scenario of short gamma ray bursts. Okay. Now I said that they have been the progenitor types have also been observationally proven. In the case of long GRBs, I said that they're coming from the collapse of massive stars, and they're also associated with a core collapse supernova. The association of a core collapse supernova is actually seen as an enhancement in the brightness over here in the light curve. So in the light curve at late times beyond 10 days, if you look, the light curve should actually fade, right? Because we said that the afterglows fade with time. But in this case over here, we are seeing that the brightness is actually increasing and there is a bump in the light curve seen over here. So this bump is coming because of an associated supernova. So this is an additional light which is coming because of the supernova. Now this association of supernova is also seen spectroscopically. So in the early phase, you only have the spectrum of an afterglow, a simple power law spectrum for an afterglow. But over time, the underlying supernova features are also visible, which proves a core collapse supernova association with long duration GRBs. So these are indirect evidences for the progenitors giving rise to such explosions. On the other hand, for a short GRB, there is no confirmed supernova association seen so far. Okay. Just to give you a summary of the long and the short GRBs, long GRBs, we said they are coming from the collapse of massive stars. These are massive stars, right? These are young massive stars like in the case of core collapse supernova. So where should they be residing? They will be present in the star-forming galaxies, and they are close to the bright UV regions of the host galaxy where there is star formation going on. Short GRBs, they're coming from the merger of two compact objects, and they can occur in both late and early type galaxies. As you can see from here, from the picture over here, the right hand side shows some of the host galaxies of short GRBs. This is an elliptical galaxy. This is an elliptical galaxy, which is a late type galaxy. This is an star forming galaxy, which means that short duration GRBs can be seen in any galaxy. These are long GRBs. These are star forming irregular galaxies where star formation is going on. And okay, so this is just about the summary of the origin of the long and the short duration gamma ray bursts. Now redshift. We are every now and then saying that GRBs are cosmological objects with the lowest redshift detected of 0.008 and the highest redshift detected of 9.4. So a lot of effort is actually required in getting the redshift of the afterglows as well as the host galaxies. So if you can see from this histogram over here, the dark black shaded region gives the distribution of the redshift for short GRBs, and the median redshift of short GRBs is around 0.5. Whereas the gray dashed region shows the distribution of redshift for the long GRBs, and the median redshift for the long GRBs is around 2, which means that long GRBs are occurring at high redshifts. What has been observationally seen so far? These are not theoretical numbers, these are observational numbers. Observationally, short GRBs so far have been seen up to a median redshift of 0.5 and long GRBs up to a median redshift of 2.0. Okay, there is one very important thing over here. We mentioned about two predominant phases in gamma ray bursts. One is the prompt phase and one is the afterglow phase. The afterglow is a long-lived low frequency component seen across different wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum. And we also mentioned about the collimation angle. So this is the collimation angle over here, when the material is coming out in the form of a jet, and then this, at some point of time, this jet starts to expand sideways. When there is a sideways expansion of the jet, the observer is located somewhere around here. Initially, the observer sees only this narrow cone, but once this lateral spreading takes place, more area is visible to the observer, which will result in a drop of flux. So at this point, we say that there is jet break that is occurring. So at the jet break time, the flux would fall sharply over here, as seen over here. Now the signatures of jet break can be seen in the light curve in the form of a steepening in the light curve. It is very important to have a measure of these jet break times from the light curve. Why? Because your jet break time is directly related to the collimation angle. There is no other way you can measure the collimation angle. And it is only when you correct for the collimation, one will calculate the collimation corrected energy. So if you can see from this expression over here, your collimation angle is related to the jet break time. It depends upon the redshift should be known, and the isotropic gamma ray energy we already know. So these are the two important observable parameters, the isotropic energy as well as the jet break time, which will give you a handle on the collimation angle as well as the collimation corrected energy. So this is how the jet breaks are seen in the afterglow light curves. You have a power law decay up to this point of time, after which it steepens or the decay index changes, and this is the same in all the bands, which also means that jet break is a phenomena which does not depend upon the band of observation. It is basically an achromatic phenomena. which means that it should be seen at the same time in all the wavelength regions. Now, when you plot the energy and the number of GRBs, you see such kind of a distribution. So the isotropic energy, if you remember in the beginning we discussed about the isotropic energy, which was dependent upon the distance which is coming from the redshift as well as the fluence in the gamma ray band, and this energy is in this range 10 to the power of 52 to 54 ergs. Whereas there is collimation. So once you correct it for collimation, this collimation corrected energy peaks around 10 to the power of 51 ergs for the GRB afterglows. Okay. All right. So now SWIFT has, there have been many satellites which are used to detect the gamma ray bursts. Like in the olden times, there was BATSE on board the Compton Gamma Ray Observatory. Then there was the High Energy Transient Explorer HETI. And the revolution in the understanding of GRBs came with the launch of SWIFT, which was launched in the year 2004. It has a very special instrument called the Burst Alert Telescope in the energy range of 15 to 150 keV, which is the hard X-ray band, that is used to detect the GRB. So this is a very wide angle detector in space, which is looking at a large fraction of the sky, and that's how it is detecting the gamma ray burst or the photons from the burst in this energy band. Okay. So with BAT detecting the GRBs, you would get a fluence in the 15 to 150 keV energy range, and you will calculate the gamma ray isotropic equivalent energy. However, it is not necessary that you will have emission always in this wavelength region. This is a very narrow wavelength range, narrow energy range for BAT. So there is something called the peak energy, which is denoted by E peak, which means that where the peak of the prompt emission is coming. So because of this narrow range of the SWIFT BAT detector, often the peak energies are missed. We are not able to see the peak energies. And because of the number of GRBs that were detected by the SWIFT satellite, several puzzles were seen in the SWIFT era, to which the observations were not able to comprehend with any of the theoretical models, and for some of these the answers are still being sought. So before the SWIFT era, actually it was, so SWIFT basically has three instruments. One is BAT, which is detecting the gamma ray burst. Then there is the X-ray telescope on board, and there is a UV optical telescope on board. So it is also seeing the X-ray afterglow and the UV afterglow if present in these bursts. So what is happening? Before SWIFT, there was no sensitive X-ray telescope which was able to record the X-ray afterglows. In the SWIFT era, the study of X-ray light curves became extensively large because of the huge number of data that SWIFT X-ray telescope would collect. So more the data, more the complications you would see. And these complications came in the form of flares in the light curve, some sort of a plateau in the light curve, again some early flares, some plateau in the light curve, and then a fall which is similar to the fading of the optical afterglow light curve. So it was very difficult to explain these features. Now again, in the year 2008, Fermi was launched. So Fermi is another gamma ray space mission which has two detectors on board, the Gamma Ray Burst Monitor GBM and the Large Area Telescope, the LAT, and the energy ranges of these are right from MeV up to GeV ranges. So it is for the first time that GRBs were studied in the MeV and the GeV ranges. So the launch of Fermi and the detection of GRBs in these energy ranges opened a completely new window in the high energy studies of gamma ray bursts. So Fermi has detected some of the brightest GRBs we have seen so far. When I say brightest, it means the isotopic gamma ray equivalent energies are very, very high. So the red diamonds that you see in this figure are the GRBs which are detected by the Fermi LAT instrument, and you see that it's almost touching 10 to the power of 55 ergs. So these are some of the brightest events that the Fermi Large Area Telescope has detected. Now, high isotopic gamma ray energy would also mean that the peak energies are high. So on the y-axis you have the peak energy, E peak, and on the x-axis you have the isotopic gamma ray equivalent energy. So again, the red triangles here are the brightest GRBs detected by LAT, crossing 10 to about, some of them even crossing about 10 to the power of 54 ergs in the isotopic equivalent energy, and very high E peaks, around 2000 keVs, if you see from this figure over here. Okay. There's another revolution which we have seen in the year 2019, where for the first time TeV photons were detected by the MAGIC telescope for a GRB 1901-14C. And this burst was also detected by the Fermi telescope up to GeV energy ranges, and then the afterglow, these green circles over here, where the afterglow was detected by the MAGIC Cherenkov detectors up to going up to 1 TeV. So this is the first time that TeV emission has been detected from any GRBs. Since then, there have been 3 GRBs which have shown TeV emission. One is, of course, this GRB. The other 2 are detected by the HESS telescope, another high energy telescope. So far we have 3 GRBs which have shown TeV emission. So this is the first burst for which the observations spanned across several orders of magnitude in the energy range, starting from TeV up to radio in the centimeter and the millimeter bands. So this provides an unprecedented opportunity to study the evolution of such a gamma ray burst and the afterglow that was associated with it. Okay. So in this lecture, I only discussed about 2 of the cosmic explosions after the Big Bang, the supernovae and the gamma ray bursts, and which are also very fascinating to study. However, there are several other varieties of transients which exist in our universe. So this figure shows the peak luminosity in the y-axis and the characteristic time on the x-axis. Okay. Out of which the GRBs are located over here. You have thermonuclear supernovae over here. You have core collapse supernovae over here. Then several other transients which are typically like longer lived. On the other hand, at short time scales, there are various other transients which are very interesting to study. One of the recent ones being the study of the fast radio bursts, which are also known as the FRBs. Then the shock breakout scenario in the type 1a supernovae. So the cosmic transients is basically a zoo. There are very many objects that are of transient nature and present in our universe for short time scales or long time scales. And the origin of all of these events is very different, which is why it is important to study an individual member of these transients category to get an idea about the progenitors and the physical mechanisms that are driving these explosions. Okay. In this figure, I would like to highlight the telescopes, especially in the optical, which are being used to follow such transient events. There are many telescopes spread across the globe, and all of these telescopes are used for the study of the transient objects that are present in our universe. Now, one important thing to note over here is the location of our country, India. If you see, India is located